Hey everybody, welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. Today, we are getting into the generations through the outer planets. In other words, we're going to talk about the generational planets, which are the big ones, the ones that affect entire cohorts of people, rather than the highly individualized ones like Venus, Mercury, Mars, all those little guys. I was inspired to do this episode because a few months ago, I was reading cards at a bachelorette brunch, and I wasn't just reading cards, actually, I was also doing natal charts. And one of the guests asked me, based on my natal chart, would you say I'm a millennial or a member of Gen Z? And I was like, I've never been asked that before, but let's take a look. And I took a look at her chart, and she was seemingly, from my perspective, kind of more on the millennial side of that zillennial divide. But in making that call, I made it from taking a look at where is Uranus, where is Neptune, where is Pluto in this individual's chart. That's really kind of how we're going to get into it today, talking about as these slow-moving planets take their time moving through signs, how are they shaping the world at large and the people born during that time frame? And then, years later, how are those influences showing up in those individuals in terms of what do they believe in? What do they care about? How do they rebel? How do they come back from a crisis? This is going to be a two-parter because it's a big, heavy topic, much like the planets that we're looking at. So, where do we begin? In your chart, you've got 10 planets. Yes, the sun and the moon count as planets in astrology. We can cut these 10 planets down into two halves, the inner, or personal planets, and the outer, or generational planets. Within the personal planets, you've also got the sun and moon, which are known as your two luminaries, but don't get too caught up on the weeds in that. Basically, the point is, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars are all known as the personal planets. These are the planets that move through signs very quickly, so the moon spends about 2 days or so in each sign. The sun spends about 4 weeks. That's why right now we're kind of coming to the last part of Aquarius season. We're going to go into Pisces season. So whenever you hear a sun sign season, that's what it's referring to. The 4 weeks, give or take, that the sun is hanging out in a given sign. Because these planets move through rather quickly, you'll get people with every placement born throughout the year. There's Pisces moons born every year. There's Leo suns and Gemini Mercuries. All of those people are born every single year. However, every year does not have Saturn in Aquarius born or Neptune in Pisces born. That's because these outer planets take a much longer time to move through the signs, years even. And then when a planet does move into a sign, such as Saturn moving into Aries this month, it stays there for a while. In Saturn's case, it stays there for about 2.5 to 3 years, so everybody born during that time frame is all going to have Saturn and Aries in their chart. That's what we mean by generational planets, although Saturn might not be the best example to use because after our personal planets, then we have Jupiter and Saturn, which are kind of in the middle of your personal and generational planets. I've heard them referred to as the social planets. They're so named because they have a somewhat longer transit time, but nowhere near what we're looking at with the big guys. For example, Jupiter spends about a year in each sign, so right now we are a little more than halfway through Jupiter in Cancer, and then Saturn, as I mentioned, hangs out in a sign for 2.5 to 3 years, give or take. It's not super precise, and planets do retrograde and station direct, but more or less, that's the time frame for these mid-range planets. Then we get to the outer planets, the truly generational planets. Uranus spends about 7 years in each sign. Neptune spends about 10 to 12 years, and Pluto spends around somewhere to 12 to 15 years. To put that into some more perspective, the sun moves through the entire zodiac, all 12 signs, in 1 year. The moon takes about 1 month, and that's why we've got that moon-month cycle. It goes quick. Once we get to Jupiter, that takes about a decade. And then Saturn takes about 29 years. That's what your Saturn return is. It's when Saturn makes its way all the way through the other signs and comes back to the exact degree where it was when you were born. Then we make a big leap. Uranus takes 84 years to go through the entire zodiac. So, while a Saturn return is a fairly common human experience, a Uranus return really isn't. That doesn't mean people don't experience them. Plenty of people reach age 84 and beyond, but notice the difference. Then we've got Neptune, which takes a whole 165 years to get all the way through the zodiac. Then Pluto takes 248 years. We don't have people who've experienced their Neptune and Pluto returns, but we do have nations that have. And this is where you might come across these ideas of these big planetary returns. Today, we're going to be focusing on Neptune placements across the generations. Now, Neptune is an interesting planet. As you probably know if you've been hanging out in astrology kind of spaces, Neptune just went into Aries and is currently hanging out conjunct Saturn over there in Aries. So, short and dirty, because I don't want to get super duper into the weeds about current transits. That's the kind of thing that maybe I'll talk a bit about on a Substack or Instagram. But Neptune is the planet that's all about collective beliefs. It can be the planet of delusions, but delusions, beliefs, however you want to spin that, it's all of those things. It's abstractions, it's belief systems, it's what do you romanticize? Or really, when we're looking at it through this generational lens, what does an entire cohort of people romanticize? What do they buy into and believe in and really take as a big part of their belief system and, in a large part, kind of make into a reason for why do they do the things that they do? Why do they enact the social movements that they enact? And why do they kind of, as a whole, shift society one way or the next? Uranus might largely speak more to how they do it, but Neptune is what's going on in their hearts and minds, making them do that. So to bring it back to Neptune hanging out with Saturn over in Aries, we just collectively moved out of Neptune in Pisces. So from approximately 2011 till about now, Neptune was right at home in dreamy, abstract Pisces. That's why we saw a huge rise in spiritualism and just more people getting into this whole world of astrology, mysticism, New Age religions, tarot, all of those things. They had a moment largely because Neptune was in Pisces, so we were all very primed for let's pour our beliefs into the abstract and the unknown. Let's engage with what might not be completely tangible, but is very spiritually enriching. Now, of course, there's a shadow side to everything, and what else did we see happening during this period? We saw some of the wackiest conspiracy theories, and both of these generational episodes are going to be kind of US based because as an American, that's really what I'm familiar with and able to speak most on. So I'm going to try not to be so culturally specific in my references, but I think there are going to be a number of more US focused references that come out to illustrate certain things. So apologies ahead of time to my international listeners. I'm going to do my best to explain every reference that maybe isn't immediately apparent. But bringing it back, conspiracy theories are nothing new, but what did we see going on during Neptune and Pisces? The complex, crazy ones like QAnon and stuff, and I'm not trying to politicize this or come out in favor or against any sort of thing, but I want to talk more to kind of the environment that made us more likely to have that sort of thing unfold and really get a stranglehold on us and, really kind of show up in our lives in a way that perhaps it wouldn't have shown up in a previous era. And then we have Saturn, who is all about responsibility and pragmatism, and I feel like I drone on and on about Saturn a lot, but yeah, so now what happens when these two come together? Well, we're getting real about our delusions, and we're getting from spirituality for vibes and feels sake to okay, we have to kind of believe in something a bit more tangible and a bit more forward focused because they're in Aries. So Saturn is kind of bringing that gravity to Neptune, and they're doing it in fiery, motivated, self-starter Aries. So we're seeing things happen in the US and across the world. So if you or someone you know is having a baby now-ish, that baby is going to have a very powerful placement in their chart. They're going to have Neptune conjunct Saturn in Aries somewhere in their chart. So, yeah, we're seeing how these generational planets, they're there from the very beginning. So, in both these episodes, we're going to look at all the current living generations. The silent generation, which were people born between about 1928 to 1945. And again, some of these parameters might change from culture to culture. So there might be slightly different cutoffs from place to place. After them, we've got the baby boomers, who are usually defined as being born between 1946 to 1964. Followed up by Generation X, who are often defined as 1965 through 1980. Then we got Millennials, who are often defined as being born between 1981 and 1996. Then Generation Z, who is often defined as 1997 to 2012. And we're also going to take a look at Generation Alpha, which are all the people born between about 2013 and 2025. So I guess all of your powerful Neptune-Saturn conjunction babies, those guys are Generation Beta. They're the people after Gen Alpha. So here we go. We're kicking off a whole new batch of generational planet people. For the silent generation, roughly defined as the individuals born between 1929 and 1945, most people have Neptune in either Virgo or Libra. There was a teeny tiny glimpse for about 6 months in 1929 that Neptune retrograded back into Leo, but for the most part, that's it. If you take a look at a chart of where Neptune was going during this time frame, you'll see it moves around. These are called ingresses. So when a planet moves into a sign, the entire time it spends in that sign is known as a transit, but that entry point is known as an ingress. So when you hear Neptune's first ingress into Virgo occurred in, taking a look over now, 1928, that's known as, okay, that was the first time it went into there during this transit, but then it retrogrades back out. Then it makes its second ingress a little later in July 1929. So that's all that it means when you hear the word ingress. We've got ingresses into and out of Virgo and Libra during this time frame. So what does this mean? What do these people believe in, and how did it show up in their lives? Well, with Neptune and Virgo, you've got people who prioritize things like hard work, integrity, doing your part, attention to detail, delayed gratification, pragmatism. Really, Neptune in Virgo is belief in the power of pragmatism. I also want to revisit this idea of doing your part, because that's very Virgoan. That sense of you have a duty to do, so you're going to do it. But it also shows up in Neptune in Libra, which is what the second half of this cohort largely has. So we've got a couple of retrogrades, all different ingresses going on, but for the most part, we can divide the silent generation down into the first half, give or take, have Neptune in Virgo, and the second half, give or take, have Neptune in Libra. For the most part, the big, long generation-defining transits were Neptune being in Virgo from July 1929 through October 1942, and then being in Libra from August 1943 through December 1955. So, as you can see, Libra really kind of acts as that bridge between the silent generation and the baby boomers. And for that time frame in between those transits I just mentioned, we had ingress into Libra, retro back to Virgo, ingress back to Libra. But that sense of doing your part, that also shows up for the Neptune and Libra people. Goodwill is still paramount, but the focus shifts a little bit. The how shifts. It's no longer about the practical parts of working toward a better world, but the interpersonal aspect. Because Neptune in Libra really strives for social equality and a peaceful harmony. Those are all very Libran things. And by the time these people were adults, they were the original hippies. They were the ones who were here for, how are we going to save our planet? How are we going to make this a better place? For them, living their values meant launching social movements like the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the rise of environmentalism. And just a little side note, because I think this is a relevant place to drop it in, Neptune is considered to be the higher octave of Venus. So what does that mean? Well, in astrology, we have those larger planets are often considered to be kind of the more evolved versions of some of those smaller planets. Maybe more evolved isn't the best way to describe, maybe kind of like bigger sibling, more expanded version, maybe enhanced version is a better way to put it. But let's think about Venus. Venus is the planet of what do you love? What do you value? What are those things that you hold dear? Then Neptune is, well, what do you believe in? What do you romanticize? So you see how one of them is kind of, all right, what's a bit closer to me? What do I love? And then what do I love broadly? What do I love in the big picture? And I love so much that I dream about it and I fantasize about it. And perhaps I'm not always realistic about it, but that's because you're biased toward it. Of course, you're going to romanticize something that you've built up in your head and your heart to be such a beautiful, wonderful thing. Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. Now let's think about those guys for a second. Mercury is your thought processes and your speech. It's what am I thinking? What am I saying? How does my mind work? Uranus is how do you rebel? How do you recognize what's not working and decide, I'm going to retool this, I'm going to change this? What am I becoming awakened to and then ushering in a shift around? So while Mercury might be kind of, okay, this is what I'm thinking about, this is what I'm concerned with, and what I'm just talking about, Uranus is, what have I now been enlightened about? And what am I going to now speak broadly about and usher in changes surrounding? Then Pluto is the higher octave of Mars. Mars is the aggressive planet. Mars is the assertive planet. Mars is how do I tackle something? How do I overcome something? How do I take all my energy and push it towards something that I want to achieve and I want to get done? Pluto is that blown out onto a huge scale. Pluto is what must I destroy in order to replace? Mars might start the fight, but Pluto finishes it and then tidies up in the aftermath. After the silent generation came the baby boomers, which is roughly defined as those born between 1946 and 1964. And as far as Neptune signs go, we've already discussed a whole swath of them. Everybody born up until December 1955 within this generation has Neptune in Libra. They share that idealization of a peaceful, harmonious world with the cohort that immediately preceded them. But then what comes next? We've got an ingress to Scorpio, a retrograde back to Libra, another ingress, a little back and forth, which you're actually going to see throughout this episode. That's actually a pretty common theme when Neptune moves into a new planet is it goes forward, it retros, goes forward. But then in August 1957, Neptune made its way into Scorpio and hung out there until January 1970. So the second half of the baby boomers, they've all got Neptune in Scorpio. And if you're paying attention to the dates, yes, this overlaps into the first section of Generation X. And because I gotta throw it out there for anyone who's listening who's part of this little cusper generation, Generation Jones is in there too. That's often kind of what they consider the younger boomers, the earlier Gen Xers. They're their own little cuspy micro generation. We got a couple of those we'll cover in this episode. But anyway, those people, they've got Neptune and Scorpio too. So what does that mean? Well, Scorpio is all about deep transformation and pulling back the curtain. It's pulling up the rug and revealing the hardwood floor underneath. Or maybe it's not a hardwood floor. Maybe it's poured concrete. Whatever it is, you're pulling back whatever's pretty and nice, but possibly kind of fake, to get real, because that's what these people idealize. They idealize getting real about the unpleasant parts of our world, human life, our society, because they see that authenticity as the key to building a better world. I think it's interesting to look at this Neptune placement as a pendulum swing from the previous one, because Neptune in Libra is all about let's look past our differences, let's hold hands across the aisle, we can all be friends. Neptune in Scorpio can come across as a bit cynical, but right here, they're gritty. That's a better way to put it. This placement sees the pretensions that come with all of that, yes, let's hold hands, as really being in the way of living better as a society. They see that as, hey, this is window dressing. This is perhaps a bit fake. That's not us. we see past it, we cut through it. I know that cynicism and that scathing your way through the fakeness, the pretensions is often associated with Gen X. And yeah, the first swath of them still have this Neptune and Scorpio placement. But then, after ingress retrograde, that same pattern going on, Neptune entered Sagittarius in November 1970 and stayed there until January 1984. Now, before we get more into Neptune and Sagittarius, let's just talk about this pattern that we're seeing unfold because, as you can see, each generation has basically kind of two Neptune signs that really are its people, and you can more or less neatly cut it into the first half, the second half. Now, as we get a little later on, we're going to see this pattern get disrupted, but I want to talk about it here because planetary transits don't fit so neatly into marketing and demographic descriptors the way that we often think of them. If anything, if we're just going by Neptune, it kind of shortens generations a bit. And this is also where I think culture comes in because different countries are going to have different defining historical events or different cultural trends that kind of define generations. For example, in the US, it's typically considered if you're too young to remember where you were on 9/11, you're part of Gen Z. But if you didn't grow up in the United States, that's not the same cultural touchpoint that it would be for an American. But I do think it's interesting to see how Neptune shows up and shapes these groups of people who are sometimes lumped with others with very different ideals simply because they were born in the 10 or 15 years preceding or following them. This is also why you might see siblings who are, say, 5 or 6 years apart who seem like they have just very, very different outlooks and different views. That it's like, wait, you're chronologically kind of close, but you seem like you came from two totally different generations. But all right, back to it. So, what about the second half of Generation X and the very beginning of the millennials? Because Neptune was in Sagittarius until 1984. If we're defining as millennials as starting in 1981-82, guess what? Some of the early ones have Neptune in Sag. I've also heard those people referred to as the Xennials. So, all right, these people, well, for them, they believe that there are no boundaries. Everything is infinitely growable and doable, and there's a large emphasis on the power of self-improvement. There's a tendency to romanticize this idea that we just have infinite room to explore and infinite room to grow, and yeah, embracing life's uncertainties is a key part of it. That's because those uncertainties are figure-outable. There's a sense of recognition of life's unpleasantries that Neptune and Scorpio really revealed, but Neptune in Sagittarius says, yes, those are here, those are reality, and we can grow from them. These people aren't ones to dwell. So where does a planet go after it's in Sagittarius? Capricorn! So, after a quick ingress, little retrograde, and then an ingress again, Neptune made its way into Capricorn in November 1984 and stayed there until January 1998. So, once again, we've got almost everyone within one generation and a little preview of the next one, those very early Gen Zers, sometimes known as Zillennials. Yeah, they've got the tail end of this Neptune and Capricorn transit. So what does this mean? What do these people idealize? Well, this is where we got startup culture and hustle culture and hashtag boss babe. Let's bring it back down to what does this really mean on an astrological level? Well, it's romanticizing stability through material success. It's a strong belief in having total control over your material destiny and being able to work hard to achieve whatever it is you're going after. We do see a lot of romanticizing entrepreneurship here, and that can turn into romanticizing hustle culture. But we're going to get back to the shadow sides of all of these a little later. Neptune in Capricorn believes, on the one hand, in delayed gratification, but also in enjoying the fruits of your labor. There's an idealized sense of, I worked for this, I deserve it. And now compare that back to Neptune in Virgo, which we talked about earlier, because that was our other Neptune in an Earth sign that we talked about in this episode. I don't think there are any people with Neptune and Taurus alive right now. No, there are not. The last person with Neptune and Taurus was born in 1899, and we're not going to have people with Neptune and Taurus born again until 2038. So, we will likely see those people in our lifetimes. I guess they'll largely be the children of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, but before I get too far ahead of myself, let's think about the difference between how Neptune and these two different Earth signs, Virgo and Capricorn, tend to operate and what they tend to idealize. When we were talking about Neptune and Virgo, there was a lot of sacrifice and there was a lot of doing your part. There was a sense of pragmatism, but I think there was a lot more idealization of I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to cross my T's. I'm going to pay attention to the details. I'm going to really be grounded and responsible in that way. Neptune and Capricorn similarly idealizes being responsible, buckling down, but it's because there's a promise of a reward and a payoff. Now, whether that payoff actually comes depends on the individual, and I guess largely we'll see. But that's really our impetus, that's our drive here. And I think maybe that's the characteristic that sometimes gets millennials labeled as being entitled. The way the millennials see it, yeah, we are entitled to the fruits of our labor. That's our labor. It's very Seven of Pentacles. After a little Aquarian teaser in 1998, followed by a retrograde, Neptune made its way into Aquarius in November 1998 and hung out there until April 2011. So now we've got Neptune in another sign ruled by Saturn, so we're still going to see a little bit of that crossover of that Saturnian responsibility, pragmatism, a lot of that going on here. But how does Neptune in Aquarius inspire Gen Z and their beliefs and their outlooks? Well, Aquarius rules technology, and these people are the first true digital natives. There's a strong emphasis on the belief that technology is the key to a better world. We see climate change happening. Let's build the tech to mitigate that. We see vast inequality and vast social ills. Well, perhaps technology can play a key in resolving those. And it's not just technology. What else is Aquarius all about? It's the humanitarian sign. It's the sign of let's pour back into the collective. A rising tide brings up all the boats. So there's a lot of that here. There's a lot of altruism. I see it as a general belief in the power of the collective. I also see a strong belief in breaking out of the norms and just breaking out of the systems that preceded and really built the society that now Gen Z is like, as we pick up that torch, we're going to get rid of a lot of things that we don't want to carry forward. Think very after the tower kind of energy. It's not the same as that Scorpio of, oh, I'm going to rip back the upper layer and reveal the dark, bloody grossness underneath. It's more of like, hey, we're going to reform this. We're going to restructure this. We're going to think outside the box and take a look at what's happening as they continue to enter the workforce and kick off their careers. We've got a large switch to telecommuting. We've got automation really changing how people work. Gen Z is on the front lines of all of these changes happening and really restructuring what people do in the day-to-day. Then the entry about Gen Alpha is going to be a little short because, well, the people in this generation, they're all children. The eldest members of Gen Alpha were born in 2013. Most of them have Neptune in Pisces because most of them were born during this Neptune transit that we just moved out of. There are a handful who had that little glimpse of Neptune in Aries, but we're going to be talking about Neptune in Pisces here. So how is that potentially going to play out with this generation? Well, we saw the idealism of spirituality, and we saw a deep belief in, hey, perhaps everything is fluid. What are facts? What are alternative facts? We saw all of this happening, and could we potentially be looking at a generation that really shifts human spirituality? Might we see a lot of new religious and spiritual movements crop up as Gen Alpha becomes adults? One way that we can potentially take a look at what's in store for these people is to look back at the adults of the last Neptune and Pisces transit. Now, of course, it's a very different time period. The last time that these people were born, the world looked very different. I couldn't find an ephemeris that goes back to last time Neptune was in Pisces, so I had to do a little math. It was approximately 1861. Figured that out by 2026 minus 165, which is about how long it takes for Neptune to go through the whole zodiac. So, yeah, we're thinking like Civil War era. The people born in the 1860s were the last cohort that we had with Neptune and Pisces. Now, what were those people doing as adults? Well, toward the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th century, we saw a lot of spiritual movements and uprisings. That's really where the whole idea of spiritualism, kind of in the modern sense, with, say, like talking boards and the secret societies like the Golden Dawn, who all was starting them? Probably a lot of those Neptune and Pisces folks. Now, am I suggesting that your child who's currently in elementary school might start a secret society later in their life? I'm not explicitly suggesting that, but I'm not saying it's out of the question. I do think it's important to talk a bit about the shadow side of each of these placements because every placement has a shadow side. Everything comes with a good and a bad. With Neptune specifically, this is where we get the delusional side of it and the idea that you believe in something so strongly that you're actually not really being realistic about it. So, where can things go wrong? Well, for the silent gen set who has Neptune in Virgo, things can really go awry by over sacrificing. These people saw the value and the virtue in sacrificing, doing things the prescribed way, kind of, let's all do our part. Let's all pay attention to the details and essentially be responsible, good students, practical, all of that. Sometimes that can get to the point of denying your own needs and really giving, and doing your part so hard that you're not doing your part for yourself. Think kind of the negative interpretation of a Two of Pentacles or a Six of Pentacles. This sense of, all right, you're serving, you're doing, you're providing, but are you enjoying the fruits of your labor? Then the shadow side of Neptune in Libra is sometimes in our quest to always see the best in each other and always treat everyone as equals and fairness and prioritizing all of that really just social positivity. We could sometimes look away from things that aren't great but need to be addressed. We can sometimes potentially get caught up in the superficial and really distance ourselves from things that are crying out for attention and need to be fixed because it's not pretty, it's not convenient, it's not conducive to our vision of this peaceful, harmonic, happy, friendly world, however you want to put that. Then on the flip side, Neptune in Scorpio can sometimes dwell on the negative so much that that transformation that Scorpio promises doesn't happen. Sometimes you can get so caught up under the dark, the depth, the unpleasant that you end up with a chip on your shoulder. One of the challenges that people with this placement can tend to have is just being so cynical that when something good is actually happening in the collective, they don't recognize how good it is. It's almost, oh, I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm always waiting for things to turn sour again or to see through the fakeness of this good thing when maybe it really is just a good thing. And then Neptune and Sagittarius, the ones of the endless bounds and the perpetual self understanding and self growth, this generation tends to be prone to disillusionment when things turn out to be not so boundless, not so understandable and figure outable. Sometimes they can get discouraged. Sometimes it's like, oh, you really just broke the archer's bow, and can I even shoot this arrow anymore? There can be a sense of disillusionment with, hey, are we really as free as we thought we were? Or as free as we hoped we were? Then the Neptune and Capricorn set can very easily burn themselves out. When you're trying to take control of everything and do all the things and hustle your way to a better, more secure world, guess what? That's a recipe for burnout. This set can very easily get so caught up in the what am I doing and the day to day of it that they kind of forget the goal. I think they can easily lose sight of the why. Then with Neptune and Aquarius, I'd say the shadow side is becoming so dependent on technology that you lose touch with doing things the human way. Perhaps this is where we're seeing these parasocial relationships with AI characters, or using AI as a therapist or a friend or a romantic partner. Perhaps there's even some sense of disillusionment with the power of the collective. And then I'd say the shadow side of Neptune and Pisces may very well be being lost in the abstract and not really having anything grounding to anchor your ideas down to. If we want to compare Neptune in the two different water signs that we see living today, so Neptune in Scorpio versus Neptune in Pisces, I see a stark difference. For Neptune in Scorpio, it's a strong belief in we've got to get real and practical about the parts of life that aren't so nice. Like, this is reality. Neptune in Pisces is you can build your own reality. So I see a strong clash there. And I think it will be interesting to see how this generation continues to grow and flourish and unfold. I guess it'll be interesting to see how all the generations continue to grow and flourish and unfold, because no matter how old you are, it's still your first time living this life, and your generational planets shape kind of how you're a product of your time, but you're a unique individual and you have a unique relationship to that cohort of yours. So, what does this all mean for the individual? Well, on the front end, it means you're a product of your time. You are an individual, of course, we're all unique, but we also get influenced by the people around us and the environments we grow up in, and yes, the generational astrology that's going on when you're born. I tend to think of generational planets almost like generational cultures. That, yes, within any culture, it's all unique individuals, but they're also just certain traits that people pick up from living within that culture and its environment. Your natal chart also shows your unique connection to that, let's call it a cultural trait, because where that generational planet is in your chart house-wise shows where it tends to show up most prominently in your life. So, for example, I've got Neptune in Capricorn, and so does everybody else in more or less my generation. But for me, that's in house 3. For somebody else, that might be in house 7. So what that might come down to is that we have that shared collective belief in hard work, delayed gratification, all those Capricorny things. But for me, it's most apparent in my relationships to close friends and siblings, and how I communicate, and all of those third housey things, versus for someone who's got it up in house 7, it tends to show up most prominently for them in how they partner and their relationships, and really how they show up as a partner. They might tend to be someone who really takes the long game when it comes to partnering with somebody. Maybe on the evening after their first date, they're already thinking about where are we going to be 5 years down the road, versus I might not necessarily be thinking about that first in relationships, but when it comes down to like, okay, where are me and this group of friends going to be 5 years down the road? Or how is what I said or what I published going to be received 5 years down the road? So see how it's that same energy, but where it is in your chart kind of goes where it's going to light up the most. And then you have aspects to personal and even other generational planets. If you missed the episode about aspects, go back and listen to it, because I do a breakdown of things like conjunctions, oppositions, squares, all of those, and how those show up in your chart largely show how are you relating to these generational forces. Maybe you also have Neptune in Capricorn, let's stay with that, but it's squaring your sun. That's going to produce a very different relationship than somebody who has it conjunct their sun or not aspecting their sun at all. So that's about all I've got for you today. As always, thanks for listening, and stay tuned for part 2. In part 2, we're getting into Uranus and Pluto. Also, as always, if you want to keep up with me over on Instagram, my handle is its_OMG_tarot. Alrighty, talk soon. Bye bye.